Hello, I'm Kevin Cullinane, the Head of Communications at Cork Airport in Ireland, which was Ireland's fastest growing airport in 2019, coming into the pandemic year of 2020, and a year which saw remarkable challenges for all of us working in communications. Staying close to our customers during COVID-19 was pivotal, and I'm happy to share with you some of the lessons I've learned over that period. One of the challenges we have as marketeers annually is obviously increasing our passenger numbers through our terminals. And last year was no different. We had an objective of delivering 7% growth in our passenger numbers, which would have brought us close to 2.8 million passengers through Cork Airport. We also had the additional objective of increasing our market share across the south of Ireland by a further 2%. We went about this in planning in 2019 in terms of a traditional airport marketing model of increasing awareness, interest, desire, and indeed action by purchasing airline tickets through our airline partners, all 9 of them in fact, that operate scheduled services ordinarily through the airport. We had a plan in place which saw a 4-phased plan of consumer activities, which would initially target our consumers across the south of Ireland to fly from Cork Airport by being inspired by the destinations that we serve. We then obviously wanted to convert that interest and desire to fly from Cork last year into actual bookings over the March and April period. And then obviously to see people flying to those destinations, 50 plus of them in fact, out of Cork Airport into the summer of last year. And then finally we would have been targeting the off-shoulder period, trying to mop up additional city break opportunities for our consumers. We had a plan and an advertising campaign ready to roll out across traditional radio and outdoor media, as well as social media and indeed digital marketing channels that we use annually. We had the sites agreed, all mapped out, a very detailed media plan outlined of how we were going to achieve these communications objectives. Indeed, digital marketing assets were all prepared, ready to roll, and indeed some of the campaign had already instigated on the 2nd of January last year. However, St. Patrick's Day was to prove a very different Irish holiday last year to the one we all anticipated. Our Prime Minister at the time, Taoiseach Leo Varadkar, came out onto the steps of the Irish Ambassador's residence in Washington, D.C. to announce the first of what was to be 3 lockdowns in the country. And since that seminal moment in Irish history, communication has been central to all we've been doing. Indeed, whether you were involved in the COVID-19 crisis or not, you still had an opportunity to tell your story throughout the pandemic, albeit it seemed at times that COVID news was predominating our media and our news bulletins. Non-COVID stories were still gaining traction throughout the year. We've learned, I suppose, like many organizations, that you need to pivot in the middle of a crisis. You need to resolve the initial challenges that a crisis such as COVID presents, but then you need to move quickly through the various phases, building up your resilience to address the short-term challenges that any business has in terms of building up resilience and looking at how we're going to cope and manage our way through this particular crisis. And then we had a phase coming close to the 1st of July last year where it looked as if Ireland had successfully suppressed the virus, and we were moving to a nominal day 0 of a recovery. This involved detailed planning to ensure the terminal was ready for the influx of passengers we were anticipating. This meant all of those necessary social distancing decals on our floors, plexiglass screens at our check-in and security counters, making sure there was enough and sufficient hand sanitizer stations and gels available right throughout the passenger journey, from the time people arrived at the airport till the time they boarded their aircraft, and indeed following the return journey on their return to the Republic of Ireland. And then we were engaged in reimagining the next new normal, realizing that what we had left behind was going to be very different in terms of the destination we were going to be arriving at after COVID. And sadly, we've seen in the last 3-4 weeks a deterioration in the prevalence of the virus right across the community here in Ireland, which again has resulted in a shift in our response to the challenge. And looking forward, we need to be very clear about how the regulatory and the environment is going to be very different across the aviation industry from the one we left behind on the 31st of December in 2019. So the crisis has provided an opportunity. It's provided an opportunity for us to show leadership as a subject matter expert in terms of running airports, dealing with the crisis, but also not being tone deaf to the story as it's been evolving across the news bulletins, staying relevant and taking a leadership role, but also explaining the changed circumstances for our passengers, for our airline customers, and for some of the necessary health restrictions, regulations, and new laws that our government have had to put in place to protect lives and indeed livelihoods. We've been proactive in getting our message out. We've been briefing offline key influential journalists so that they understand where we're coming from, the measures we've been taking to protect our business and indeed protect our passengers and their health and well-being. We've anticipated the negatives of being involved with the story, but necessarily telling our story and getting positive messages out about how we've been planning and indeed delivering in terms of protecting our passengers who've been undertaking necessary journeys over the last 9 and 10 months, but also staying true to our message and staying on brand in terms of what Cork Airport stands for. Indeed, staying on brand means staying true to your core message. And I love this definition of a brand that's a set of expectations, memories, stories, and relationships that, when taken together, account for a consumer's decision to choose your product or service over another. Put simply, a brand is a promise made and a promise kept. And that's what we've been trying to do over the duration of this pandemic. The crisis also provides opportunity to grasp opportunities and to let positive messages resonate. Stories about people and the extraordinary lengths that they've been going to protect people. But also important that we retain a balance in our storytelling, not to be tone deaf to the circumstances of the dire circumstances people find themselves in, and the weekly and indeed daily updates of the number of people infected with the virus and sadly those who've lost their lives. Filling a hole for journalists was also important, many of whom were also working remotely from home throughout the peak of the pandemic. And this indeed helped news editors and journalists with their roles, who couldn't get out and about and visit airport terminals to see exactly for themselves how the pandemic was impacting on our business and the decimating impact it was having in terms of reducing our passenger numbers and indeed flights by over 95% at the peak of the pandemic. So it was important that we could adapt and find ways how we could fit into the news media program, and indeed providing footage and photography that would also fill the pages that needed to be filled each day and each weekend. Ordinarily, we would have built our marketing content over 3 core pillars, but sadly we found that a number of these were no longer relevant last year. So we focused on things like behind the scenes content, how the airport was looking and feeling as we were decimated of passengers, empty check-in lines, empty check-in halls, empty check-in departure gates, empty security checking and passport control areas, but also educating people about what was happening within our industry, that Cork Airport was not alone in this. This was a global pandemic, and its impact on aviation globally was in parallel to what we were experiencing here in Ireland. So what have we been doing over this period? Well, we've been focusing primarily also on our social media and digital marketing channels in the absence of any advertising in the mainstream media, because largely there were no flights for people to book. We needed to know our respective audiences for each of those channels, and we needed to be careful that we wouldn't stand on any banana skins. And with banana skins, I always think it's important that you pick them up and take them out of your way. So we didn't do any traditional photo calls. We couldn't be tone deaf to this crisis, and we didn't want to be bland or beige to what was happening. We didn't want to be a me too. We wanted to stand above some of the noise that was happening out there and stand on our own 2 feet and tell our story effectively. We remained open throughout the pandemic. We remained open to providing vital air services to assist initially with the repatriation of Irish citizens that were stranded abroad that wanted to get home to family and friends, but also those people that were in Ireland that equally wanted to return to their homelands. We also stayed relevant in terms of providing an important link for supply chains of protective equipment coming into our hospitals and healthcare facilities. We stayed relevant in terms of providing a facility for the export of key supplies from Cork. And we also had a key role to play in multiple search and rescue missions for our Air Corps, for the Irish Police, the Garda Síochána operations, and indeed medical and search evacuations. So across each of our channels, we focused on what was relevant, visually telling a story as well as through the written word. On Twitter, where we have almost 44,000 followers engaged with us on this platform, we were able to show how the airport was looking and feeling, how we were responding in terms of taking supplies from the airport to those in need, how we were staying open for organ harvesting flights, repatriating souls, staying relevant on national media also by facilitating a national moment of applause for healthcare services and personnel working on the front line. Across Facebook, we had a more humane story also to tell in terms of how we were remaining a vital cog in the national response in terms of our assistance to provide connectivity at a time when the world was at standstill. And indeed across Instagram, again, visually telling a story from behind the scenes of how we were responding, how the airport was looking, how people were feeling, and staying relevant to the national mood. And across our LinkedIn page, our corporate tone of voice was slightly different to those on some of the other social media channels, where we had the business of the airport to tell, where we had to comment on the situation, how we were dealing with a much reduced service, how we were flexing our hours of operation, providing a vital essential service during a global downturn for aviation, and supporting national efforts in an unprecedented crisis, the likes of which none of us had ever seen before. We also used our website, corkairport.com, to provide latest news bulletins to tell what was happening in terms of facilities at the airport, but also sharing news and developments in terms of the changing face of Ireland in terms of its management of the crisis and new laws and restrictive practices and additional health measures that the country was taking to deal with the crisis. In our terminal, we obviously had all of the necessary safety and well-being measures put in place very early on. This began initially with the installation of signage advising our passengers back in January and February of the prevalence of a strange virus in China if people were flying there or returning from there. But we also had to work with our operation colleagues to design and print and install a myriad of health and safety measures across a variety of media, some electronic, some in print, some in vinyl, but also getting a consistency of message across so that we could inform people very clearly and very coherently of the necessary measures we were taking to keep them safe. And indeed, internal communications came to the fore more so than it had ever done in the 16 years that I've served at Cork Airport. We were over communicating, if anything, with our staff, issuing a daily digest of news, industry news, and business updates and well-being advice from March right through to the end of August, including on Saturdays and Sundays. We then moved, as this virus was being suppressed, to a bi-weekly bulletin, and latterly that's become a weekly bulletin. And this was also amplifying key messages that were coming from our group CEO through his weekly video messages, and also our virtual town hall meetings that our own managing director in Cork was having. And this was able This now allowed us to enable our staff to be fully informed in terms of the operation of the airport, our plans, key milestones and actions we were taking in dealing with the crisis. It was also very important to reassure staff that we had a return plan, and indeed our customers, our airline customers and our passengers, that we had mapped a way forward through this crisis to when the virus would be suppressed and how we could reopen effectively and safely, and rebuilding that consumer confidence that may have been dented throughout the crisis. We still have a return plan which is constantly being evolved so that we understand how our various communication channels can respond to the new norm when it is safe to reopen the airwaves once again. Ensuring that we've stayed relevant and in touch with our consumers has led to us not alone sustaining, but indeed growing our audiences across various social media platforms, growing our audience on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, and indeed LinkedIn throughout 2020. And whether or not our industry, indeed our business, was going to face a U, V, W, or L-shaped recovery curve became somewhat an academic discourse. What we were trying to do was sweat our assets, our digital assets, our communication assets, to engage effectively and communicate coherently and inject authenticity to our message throughout what has been a very human crisis. Our tone of voice, showing compassion when necessary, but also showing optimism and our resilience and our ability to reconnect with people, was vital throughout the last 10 months. Cork Airport has a slogan of loving taking off. And that empathy in terms of an airport, a small airport, but with a very big heart, has been pivotal to staying close to our customers during COVID-19.